What happens when a millionaire marries a young, innocent woman without loving her and despises her every single day? But he never expected someone who truly loved her to appear. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to find out who this person is and how this story ends, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Don't miss this drama. The limousine stopped in front of the imposing Trinity Church in Manhattan, and Lillian felt time freeze along with her heart. The oppressive perfume of 1,000 white lilies, specially imported for the occasion, floated in the air, mingling with the ancient incense that permeated every corner of the Gothic Revival sanctuary. Her fingers, imprisoned inside lace gloves, trembled uncontrollably as she adjusted the 6-meter veil that cost more than the annual salary of an entire family. Fate sometimes leads us down paths we would never have chosen, forcing us to smile while inside we crumble, thought Lillian, observing the church that should have represented the beginning of her happiness, but now stood before her as a fortress of obligations. At 23, wrapped in a dress that weighed as much as her doubts, she was about to give her life to a man who had never been interested in truly knowing her. Harrison Montgomery, the powerful 43-year-old businessman waiting at the altar, had never asked about her favorite color, her preferred food, or the name of her most intimate dreams. For him, she was simply another requirement on his list of achievements, a strategic acquisition to appease shareholders concerned about his image as a confirmed bachelor. The interior of the church was a spectacle worthy of royalty. The central nave gleamed with light filtering through multicolored stained glass, creating hypnotic patterns on the polished marble. Each pew displayed floral arrangements that resembled white cascades falling to the floor. The guests, more than 500, all dressed in their finest attire, turned their heads simultaneously when she began her bridal march. Lillian advanced mechanically down the aisle. Each step took her further from the dreamy girl from Nantucket she once was, and transformed her into what her father, ruined by failed investments in coastal properties, needed her to be, the financial salvation of the family. And then she saw him, not Harrison, whose rigid posture at the altar reflected the attitude of someone closing a business deal rather than receiving his future wife, but him, Elliot, the groom's younger brother, seated in the third row on the right side, with that grey suit that accentuated the honey color of his eyes. Their gazes met for a fleeting but devastating instant. In that brief second, Lillian felt something she hadn't experienced during the 6 months of her engagement. An authentic connection, a mutual recognition of kindred souls trapped in circumstances they hadn't chosen. Elliot was clutching the ceremony program so tightly that the paper was beginning to tear at the edges. His eyes couldn't look away from her, from this woman he had met just 3 months earlier, during a rehearsal dinner at the family estate in the Hamptons. That night, when she dropped her embroidered linen napkin and they both bent to pick it up at the same time, their fingers touched for 3 brief seconds that seemed eternal. He had seen something in her eyes then, something he now recognized clearly, a silent cry for rescue, a sadness so deep it seemed endless, like the Atlantic Ocean on a moonless night. As the minister began the ceremony, Lillian thought about how she had reached this point. Her father's debts, the secret meetings, contracts signed at midnight, the fake love story presented in society magazines. It was all an elaborate theater mounted to satisfy social expectations, while behind the scenes, a business deal was closed where she was simply the main commodity. There are chains that cannot be seen but weigh more than iron, she reflected, feeling how the corset beneath her dress increasingly restricted her breathing, just as the life she was about to begin would prevent her from breathing freely for years. The honeymoon in Martha's Vineyard turned out to be exactly what Lillian feared, a silent disaster wrapped in excessive luxury. The private villa with panoramic views of the Atlantic was a palace of marble and glass, where a dozen staff appeared and disappeared like ghosts, anticipating desires she didn't even have time to formulate. Harrison spent 18 hours daily locked in the suite's office, his voice resonating through the walls as he shouted orders during endless video conferences. The constant sound of keys being furiously struck and the ring of incoming calls formed the soundtrack of this supposed honeymoon. Lillian, meanwhile, wandered alone along the golden sand beach, letting the turquoise water lick her bare feet, wondering if she would ever feel alive again. "Do you need anything else, Mrs. Montgomery?" the butler constantly asked, a discreet man in his 50s who seemed to materialize from nowhere. My freedom, she thought, but smiled politely and shook her head. Nothing, thank you. Everything is perfect. The nights were perhaps the worst. Harrison came to the bedroom when she was already pretending to sleep, bringing with him the strong aroma of aged Macallan whiskey. He would slide between the Egyptian cotton sheets without even looking at her, always maintaining a prudent distance, as if marriage were just a title, a social label, without any real content. In 2 weeks of travel, they shared only 3 meals together. During all of them, he spent more time looking at his phone screen than at his wife's face. The conversations, when they existed, revolved exclusively around family businesses or the next public appearances they should make together. One afternoon, sitting on the terrace while contemplating the horizon where the sky merged with the sea in a perfect line, Lillian received a message on her phone. It was an unknown number. "Are you happy?" it simply said. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Those 3 seconds when their fingers touched while picking up the napkin had triggered something she didn't even dare to name. She looked toward the office door, closed as always, and replied with trembling fingers, "Happiness is a luxury some people cannot afford." The response came almost instantly. "Everyone deserves to be happy, including you. Especially you." Those words, simple but devastating, etched themselves in her memory like fire. During the rest of the trip, there were no more messages, but they weren't necessary either. Something had changed inside her. A small seed of rebellion had been planted in fertile ground. When they returned to the estate in Westchester, a 12,000-square-foot property surrounded by gardens full of jasmine and cherry trees, Lillian discovered another painful truth. Her bedroom was separated from Harrison's by a long corridor of colonial woodwork. "It's more practical this way," he explained coldly as the staff unpacked their luggage. "I wake up very early for meetings and I don't want to disturb you." That word, disturb, sounded like bother, as if her mere presence were a necessary inconvenience. Lillian nodded mechanically, observing the closet the size of the apartment where she had grown up in Nantucket. There hung designer dresses she had never chosen, expensive perfumes that didn't suit her skin, sky-high shoes that hurt her feet accustomed to comfortable flats. "The most dangerous cages are those we don't recognize as such," she thought as she closed the door of her new golden prison, "especially when they are decorated with Italian silk and diamonds." Life at the estate proceeded with the monotony of a Swiss clock. Lillian quickly learned the unwritten rules of her new existence. Be present at important dinners, smile appropriately at charity events, maintain superficial conversations with the wives of Harrison's business partners, and above all, never, ever show any public sign of discontent. Collins, the butler who had served the Montgomery family for 40 years, became her silent ally. The man, with his characteristic discretion and look of understanding, seemed to perfectly comprehend what was happening behind the facades of happiness everyone strove to maintain. "Would the madam like tea in the library this afternoon?" asked Collins one morning as Lillian ate breakfast alone in the inner courtyard. "Yes, please," she replied, silently thanking him for noticing her small routines, her attempts to create her own space in this alien world. The library had become her refuge, 3 walls covered with books from floor to ceiling, large windows overlooking the Hudson in the distance, worn leather armchairs that bore the imprints of previous generations. There she spent hours reading Whitman, Dickinson, and Plath, mentally escaping through their verses. It was precisely in the library where she encountered Elliot again, 2 months after the wedding. She was absorbed in a copy of Leaves of Grass when the door opened silently. "Sorry, I didn't know you were here," he said, stopping at the threshold as if he had entered sacred ground. Lillian looked up, surprised. Her heart leaped upon recognizing those honey-colored eyes, that shy smile that contrasted so much with Harrison's perpetually severe expression. "No problem," she replied, automatically closing the book. "I was just leaving." "Please don't leave on my account," said Elliot, approaching the nearest bookshelf. "I only came to look for a book on architecture. I like to draw old buildings in my spare time." An uncomfortable silence ensued as he searched among the volumes. Lillian observed him discreetly. His way of moving was completely different from Harrison's. Where the older brother was all right angles and calculated movements, Elliot flowed naturally, like water finding its course. "Whitman," he commented upon noticing the book she was holding. "I am large. I contain multitudes." Lillian couldn't help smiling. You know, Whitman. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world, Elliot recited from memory, sitting in the armchair across from her. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I didn't imagine you liked poetry, she confessed, surprised to find something so unexpected in this house, where art seemed to be valued solely for its market price. There are many things about me that no one imagines, he responded with an enigmatic smile. In this family, having artistic sensitivity isn't exactly considered a merit. The conversation flowed with surprising naturalness. They talked about books, music, the small coastal towns where Lillian had grown up, the smell of fresh blueberry muffins that filled the streets of New England towns each morning. For the first time since her arrival at the estate, she laughed sincerely, a laugh that began in her chest and expanded, illuminating her entire face. Elliot watched her, fascinated, like someone contemplating a rare natural phenomenon. You should laugh more often, he said softly. Your laugh, it changes the whole room. The comment, so simple and direct, made Lillian's cheeks flush pink. Suddenly she became painfully aware of the situation. She was enjoying the company of her husband's brother, much more than that of her own spouse. It's getting late, she said abruptly, standing up. I should prepare for tonight's dinner. Elliot nodded without trying to stop her, but when she was about to reach the door, his voice halted her. Lillian, he said, pronouncing her name as if it were a precious and fragile word. On Wednesdays at this time I always come to the library, just so you know. She didn't respond, but as she climbed the stairs to her room, a warm sensation spread through her chest. For the first time in months, there was something to look forward to with excitement. The most dangerous connections, she thought as she prepared for another business dinner, where she would be little more than a decorative ornament, are those that are born when we no longer expect them, illuminating corners of our soul we believed forever lost. The accidental encounters multiplied in the following weeks. Lillian and Elliot crossed paths in the garden during the quiet afternoon hours, when the summer heat forced everyone to seek refuge in the coolness of the rooms. They met in the cherry orchard, where she fed the finches with breadcrumbs. They saw each other in the library, always at the same time, always pretending surprise. Harrison, absorbed in his commercial empire that now extended to the West Coast, noticed nothing. He spent 3 weeks of every month traveling between Chicago and San Francisco, returning only for social events where he needed to exhibit his young wife, like someone showing off a newly acquired trophy. On one of those rare nights when Harrison dined at home, Elliot was also present. The enormous oak table, which could seat 20, made the three of them seem like castaways in an ocean of polished mahogany. Collins served the dishes with the same solemnity with which a priest would officiate a mass. The Californians have accepted the offer, commented Harrison, breaking the silence as he meticulously cut a piece of steak. They'll buy 40% of our shares in the Napa Valley vineyards. Congratulations, Elliot replied without enthusiasm, taking a sip of wine. I suppose that means more trips to San Francisco. Of course. Someone has to personally supervise that everything develops according to plan. Lillian remained silent, observing the dynamic between the brothers. Where Harrison saw success, Elliot seemed to see only the erosion of something authentic. Where one celebrated international expansion, the other seemed to lament the loss of local identity. And you, Lillian? Harrison suddenly asked, as if he had just remembered he was married. What have you been doing during my absence? The question took her by surprise. It was the first time in weeks he had shown any interest in her activities. I've been painting, she replied cautiously. I converted the small room on the 3rd floor into a studio. Painting, Harrison repeated, slightly furrowing his brow. I didn't know you painted. There are many things about your wife you don't know, Elliot intervened, with an apparently casual tone that hid a rebuke. Lillian has extraordinary talent. Her landscapes of the Hudson Valley capture the essence of northeastern light like few contemporary artists. The look Harrison directed at his brother contained a mixture of surprise and irritation. And since when are you an art expert? I don't need to be an expert to recognize beauty, Elliot responded, holding his brother's gaze. The tension grew until it became almost palpable. Lillian felt short of breath, trapped between these two opposing forces. Finally, Harrison turned his attention to the phone that was constantly vibrating beside his plate. I need to take this call, he announced, rising without waiting for a response. "It's Hong Kong. I can't postpone it." When they were left alone, the silence became deafening. Elliot contemplated his glass as if it contained all the answers of the universe. "You shouldn't have said that," Lillian finally murmured. "Harrison doesn't know I've shown you my paintings." "It shouldn't be a secret," he replied, raising his gaze. "Your talent deserves to be recognized, not hidden in a room on the 3rd floor that your husband doesn't even know you use. Things are more complicated than they seem." "Are they? To me, they seem painfully simple," said Elliot, leaning slightly toward her. "You're married to a man who doesn't see you, who doesn't know what color you like, what music you listen to, what dreams you have. A man who bought a wife like he buys a vineyard in Napa for convenience and prestige." The words hit Lillian like slaps, not because they were false, but because they exposed a truth she was striving not to face. "And what do you suggest? That I abandon everything and escape like a protagonist in a romantic novel?" she asked bitterly. "My family depends on Harrison's financial support. My father lost everything in disastrous investments. My mother needs expensive medical treatments. My siblings are studying thanks to his generosity." Elliot kept silent, aware of the trap in which she was caught. Finally, he took her hand across the table. It was a brief gesture but full of meaning. "I can't give you solutions," he said with a husky voice, "but I can offer you something he will never give. The truth. And the truth is that you deserve much more than this. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not exhibited as a valuable acquisition." When Harrison returned 20 minutes later, he found them animatedly discussing the latest exhibition at the Met, like two old friends sharing a common passion. If he noticed anything strange, he didn't mention it. The most devastating truths, thought Lillian that night as she watched Harrison sleep on his side of the bed, as distant as ever, are not those shouted at us by our enemies, but those whispered to us by those who are beginning to matter too much. October arrived in Westchester, with torrential rains that transformed the estate gardens into living watercolors. The colors seemed more intense under the leaden sky, the red of the autumn leaves, the deep green of the pines, the blood red of the roses that climbed the centuries-old walls. Lillian spent more and more time in her improvised studio, capturing on canvas the landscapes she saw from her window, but also the interior landscapes of her soul. Her paintings, previously dominated by pastel tones and soft lines, now showed violent contrasts, storms of color that reflected her growing emotional tumult. That rainy Tuesday, the library was particularly silent. The foggy windows blurred the silhouette of the Hudson in the distance, transforming it into a grayish stain barely distinguishable through the mist. Lillian traced the spines of the old books with her fingertips, looking for something that might distract her from her recurring thoughts about Elliot, when she found, hidden behind an old edition of Moby Dick, a worn notebook with black covers. Curiosity overcame her usual respect for others' privacy. She opened the notebook and immediately recognized the inclined, nervous handwriting. It was Elliot's diary, dated 10 years ago when he was only 21. The yellowed pages told the story of a sensitive young man who had grown up under the suffocating shadow of a relentless older brother. A boy who was always considered weak by his father, Mr. Nathaniel Montgomery, compared to the successful and strong Harrison. There were pages and pages about abandoned dreams, a career in architecture, restoring colonial mansions that he never pursued because the family business needed his support, unrequited loves, lonely nights in luxury hotels during business trips he detested. One entry in particular squeezed her heart. "Sometimes I think we live deceiving ourselves. We believe decisions are ours when in reality we follow paths traced by others long before our birth. My brother accepts this destiny with pride because it coincides with his ambitions. I accept it with resignation because I lack the courage to break the chains that bind me to a surname that weighs like a tombstone. What would my father think if he knew I dream of restoring old buildings instead of building empires? That I prefer Frost's verses to financial reports? Probably the same thing he thinks now, that I am a disappointment." Lillian was so absorbed in reading that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps. When she looked up, Elliot was standing at the threshold of the door, pale as marble. His eyes moved from the diary in her hands to her shocked face. "You shouldn't have read that," he said with a hoarse voice but without anger, only with a vulnerability he had never shown before. Lillian closed the notebook carefully, pressing it against her chest. "I feel the same way," she confessed in a broken whisper, "as if I were living someone else's life, as if each day were a disguise that doesn't fit me, but that I'm forced to wear." They stared at each other across the library, physically separated by yards of wooden floor, but united by an understanding that transcended any distance. The rain beat hard against the windows, creating a curtain of noise that isolated them from the rest of the world. Elliot was the one who broke the silence, crossing the room with determined steps. But he stopped an arm's length away from her, respecting an invisible line that both knew they shouldn't cross. "I wish I could give you the life you deserve," he said, his voice laden with an old pain. "I wish I could wake up every morning knowing you'd smile when you saw me." "I wish I could—" "Don't say it," Lillian interrupted, placing a trembling finger on her own lips. "If you say it, everything will become real. And if it becomes real, I don't know how I'll be able to continue living this way." But her eyes told a different story. They begged him to say it, to make it real, to give her a reason to believe that true love wasn't just something that existed in the novels she devoured during her nights of insomnia. "What I feel for you," continued Elliot, respecting her request but unable to completely contain his emotions, "is like one of those old buildings I dreamed of restoring, something beautiful and authentic, buried beneath layers of conventions that prevent us from seeing its true value." Lillian felt her heart beating so hard she feared it could be heard above the drumming of the rain. With trembling hands, she returned the diary to Elliot. "Sometimes I think," she said, avoiding his gaze, "that the true tragedy isn't being trapped in a life we didn't choose, but discovering too late that another path was possible." Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the window panes vibrate. It was as if the sky itself were responding to the intensity of the moment they were sharing. "It's never too late," murmured Elliot, tucking the diary into the inner pocket of his jacket. "As long as we're breathing, there's always hope of finding the right path." They looked at each other for another moment, communicating without words everything they couldn't openly express. Then, as if they had reached a tacit agreement, they both left the library in opposite directions. "The deepest revelations," thought Lillian as she slowly climbed the stairs to her studio, "sometimes come in the form of words written years ago by someone who, unknowingly, was writing the prologue to our own story." The following weeks became a sweet torture. Lillian and Elliot developed a clandestine communication system that allowed them to keep their connection alive without raising suspicions. He began to leave small notes hidden in the books she borrowed, verses by E.E. Cummings and Emily Dickinson carefully transcribed on silk paper, tiny drawings of cherry blossoms she had mentioned adoring, words of encouragement when he sensed she had had a particularly difficult day. "Distance is just a test the fates impose on the truth of our feelings," said one of the notes hidden between the pages of The Bell Jar, the book she had been reading that week. Lillian replied with small canvases she left forgotten, in corners where she knew only he would find them. A sunset over the Brooklyn Bridge painted in golden and reddish tones to express the passion she dared not name. The stormy sea of Nantucket in deep blues to show the turbulence of her heart. A century-old oak resisting a tempest as a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. Harrison continued to be absent, physically and emotionally. His business trips grew increasingly longer, and when he was home he spent most of his time locked in his office or taking phone calls during meals. He treated Lillian with the same distant cordiality as always, like someone properly caring for a decorative plant, providing what was necessary for survival, but without genuine affection. One November afternoon, as Lillian painted in her studio, Collins discreetly knocked on the door. "Ma'am," said the butler with a worried expression, "Mr. Harrison just called. He'll be arriving tonight with Mr. Elliot and Mr. Nathaniel. It seems they've closed the deal with the Californians and wish to celebrate with a special dinner." The news fell on Lillian like a bucket of ice water. She hadn't seen her father-in-law since the wedding, and the prospect of sharing a table with all three Montgomery men filled her with anxiety. Mr. Nathaniel was known for his authoritarian character and sharp tongue, especially after several glasses of wine. "Thank you, Collins. Please ensure everything is prepared according to the master's preferences." The butler nodded and withdrew, leaving her immersed in her thoughts. Lillian contemplated the canvas she was painting, a half-finished portrait of Elliot she had begun from memory, capturing that melancholic gaze that moved her so deeply. Hastily, she covered it with a cloth before heading to her room to prepare. The dinner was exactly as she feared. Mr. Nathaniel dominated the conversation with anecdotes about his early years building the family business, occasionally interrupted by Harrison's comments on the recent international expansion. Elliot remained silent most of the time, limiting himself to nodding and drinking more wine than usual. "And you, daughter-in-law," Mr. Nathaniel suddenly said, fixing his penetrating grey eyes on her, "when do you plan to give me a grandchild? I'm not young anymore, you know. I'd like to see the continuation of the Montgomery lineage before death comes for me." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. The question, asked as casually as someone commenting on the weather, revealed the crude reality of her position in this family. She was seen as little more than a womb destined to perpetuate the family name. "Father," Harrison intervened with a practical tone, "all in due time, for now my wife is adapting to her responsibilities. An heir will come when it's convenient for our plans." "Plans?" repeated Mr. Nathaniel, releasing a dry laugh. "In my day, we didn't make plans for that. We simply fulfilled our duty as men. Your mother gave me 5 sons in 7 years, may God rest her soul." Elliot, who had remained quiet, set his glass down on the table with too much force. "Perhaps we should consider what Lillian wants," he said with a calm that barely concealed his indignation. "After all, she's a person, not just another contract in the company portfolio." The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison looked at his brother with a mixture of surprise and irritation. Mr. Nathaniel, on the other hand, narrowed his eyes with sudden interest, as if he had just witnessed something unexpectedly revealing. "Well, well," murmured the patriarch, looking alternately at Elliot and Lillian, "it seems my youngest son has developed a certain sensitivity toward female feelings. An interesting evolution for someone who was always too weak for the business world." "Don't confuse empathy with weakness, Father," Elliot responded, holding the old man's gaze. "Some of us consider treating people as human beings, and not as resources to be a strength, not a defect." Harrison coughed uncomfortably, clearly annoyed by the turn the conversation was taking. "I think we've had enough to drink for tonight," he declared, gesturing to Collins to remove the bottles. "Tomorrow we have an early video conference with the Japanese shareholders." The dinner ended shortly after, with Mr. Nathaniel retiring to his room muttering something about the new generation and the lack of character. Harrison locked himself in his office, as always, leaving Lillian and Elliot alone in the main hallway. "I'm sorry," he murmured, when they were sure no one could hear them. "I shouldn't have intervened like that, but I couldn't stand the way they were talking to you, as if you were—" "A broodmare?" she completed with bitter irony. "That's exactly what I am to them, Elliot. An investment that should bear fruit." He took a step toward her, his eyes bright with contained emotion. "Not to me," he said with a husky voice. "To me, you are a miracle, a dream I never thought possible, a living work of art that deserves to be admired for itself, not for what it might produce." Lillian felt tears threatening to overflow her eyes. "We can't continue like this," she whispered, although her body contradicted her words by leaning slightly toward him, unconsciously seeking his proximity. "This will only lead to suffering." "The suffering is already here," Elliot responded. "The only difference is that now, amid that suffering, there is also something beautiful." They separated before anyone could see them, but that night, lying in her solitary bed, Lillian understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It was no longer just a forbidden attraction, a romantic fantasy born of disenchantment and loneliness. What she felt for Elliot had become something real, tangible, and terrifying in its intensity. The most dangerous feelings, she reflected, as she observed the crescent moon through her window, are not those that are born suddenly like flames, but those that grow slowly, nourished by each glance, each word, each gesture, until they become as essential as the air we breathe. December covered Westchester with a silver mantle of frost. The estate gardens seemed frozen in time, with the fountains transformed into ice sculptures and the cherry trees stoically bearing the northeastern winter. In the distance, the Hudson Valley gleamed under the winter sun, its snow-covered hills offering a spectacle of breathtaking beauty. Elliot contemplated that landscape from the window of his apartment in the historic part of town, a few miles from the family estate. The last few weeks had been torment. Since the dinner with his father, he had tried to maintain distance from Lillian, aware of the danger their growing feelings represented. He had declined invitations to family dinners, avoided visiting the library during the hours he knew she frequented, and stopped writing notes to hide in her books. But his physical absence had not diminished the intensity of his emotions at all. On the contrary, the distance seemed to have amplified each memory, each shared moment, transforming them into treasures he constantly revisited during his nights of insomnia. The phone vibrated on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Harrison. "I need you to come to Charleston next week. Meeting with Southern investors. I won't accept no for an answer." Elliot frowned. His brother had never insisted so much that he participate in business meetings. In fact, in recent years, Harrison had seemed perfectly content keeping him on the margins of important decisions, relegating him to a merely decorative role within the family business. Another message arrived almost immediately. "Lillian will accompany me. We'll be staying at the Belmond. I've reserved a room for you too." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. Lillian in Charleston? The three of them together in the same hotel for several days. The prospect was as tempting as it was terrifying. Perhaps this was the opportunity he needed to speak with her one last time, to make a definitive decision about the future. After much reflection, he simply replied, "I'll be there." During the following days, Elliot debated between anticipation and fear. Was Harrison testing them? Did he suspect something? Or was it simply a coincidence, another demonstration of his brother's insensitivity toward others' feelings? The night before the trip, he made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his life. He took a new notebook from his desk drawer, similar to the diary Lillian had found months earlier, and began to write with a steady hand. There are moments in life when silence becomes a form of betrayal, not to others, but to oneself. "I have spent 31 years fulfilling others' expectations, following paths traced by others, sacrificing my dreams on the altar of a surname I never chose to bear. But I can no longer continue this way, not after meeting her, not after having glimpsed, however briefly, the possibility of an authentic life, a life where love is not a commercial agreement, but a free and conscious choice. This trip to Charleston will be my dividing line. Either I find the courage to definitively break with this half-existence I lead, or I resign myself forever to being my brother's shadow, the disappointing son, the man who renounced his happiness out of fear of the consequences. Lillian deserves more than crumbs of attention. She deserves someone who sees in her not the perfect wife, but the imperfectly wonderful woman she is. And I deserve the opportunity to be that someone, even if the whole world opposes it." He closed the notebook with resolution and tucked it into the suitcase he had prepared for the trip. He didn't know exactly what would happen in Charleston, but he was determined that whatever it was, this time he would face the consequences with his head held high. The Belmond Charleston Place Hotel stood majestic in the historic district, its elegant facade gleaming under the southern winter light. Elliot arrived at dusk, just as the first stars began to appear in the cobalt blue sky. At reception he was informed that Harrison and Lillian had already arrived hours earlier, but that his brother was in a preparatory meeting with the investors in the main hall. Lillian, apparently, had gone out for a walk around the city. Elliot left his luggage in his room and decided to go look for her. He knew Charleston well from previous visits, and could imagine exactly where someone with Lillian's artistic sensitivity would go on her first visit to the city. The Battery, with its antebellum mansions overlooking the harbor, the cobblestone streets filled with art galleries, or perhaps one of the small waterfront parks. He found her exactly where he had predicted she would be, in front of the window of a small gallery in the heart of the historic district, contemplatively observing an exhibition of watercolors capturing the southern landscapes with impressionist brushstrokes. Under the golden light of the street lamps, with a blue cotton scarf wrapped around her neck and small drops of drizzle beginning to fall on her dark hair, she looked like the protagonist of a painting he would have titled, "Beauty Contemplating Beauty." "Lillian," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and surprise lit up her face before she could hide it. "Elliot," she whispered, as if pronouncing his name were a forbidden act. "What are you doing here?" He crossed the street, dodging a cyclist who was passing hurriedly, until he stood before her. My brother invited me to join him for some meetings with Southern investors. I said no 3 times, but he insisted. He paused, searching her eyes for some sign. I think he's trying to force me back into the company, to tie me back to the family. Or perhaps, in some dark corner of his mind, he suspects something and is testing us. I don't know. But when I found out you would be here, I almost cancelled. Then I thought, maybe it's a sign, maybe the universe is giving us one last chance. Lillian looked nervously around, fearing someone might hear them. We shouldn't talk here, she murmured. Harrison is in a meeting that will last hours, Elliot interrupted. Please grant me this moment. We've spent weeks avoiding each other, and there are things I need to tell you. Something in his tone, in the intensity of his gaze, made Lillian slowly nod. All right, but not here. I know a quieter place. She guided him through the cobblestone streets to a small cafe hidden in an alley near the waterfront. It was a cozy place, with only half a dozen tables and a nautical decor that spoke of weathered storms and overcome shipwrecks. They sat in a corner away from the window, where the dim light created a bubble of intimacy. I've been thinking a lot, Elliot began after they were served 2 cups of coffee. About us, about this impossible situation, about what we should do. There is no us, Elliot, she replied sadly. Just 2 people trapped in circumstances they didn't choose. That's precisely what I want to change, he said, leaning forward. I've decided to leave the family business, to look for work in another city to start over, and I wanted to ask if you would be willing to do the same. Lillian looked at him with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. Are you asking me to leave your brother? To abandon my family, who depends on Harrison's financial support? Do you have any idea what that would mean? I know, he replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. It sounds selfish, even cruel. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and that what you and my brother have is not a marriage, it's a business contract disguised as a sacred union. Lillian kept silent, contemplating the steam rising from her cup, as if it contained answers to questions she didn't even dare to formulate. I consulted a lawyer in secret, she finally confessed. When Harrison announced this trip, I took the opportunity to meet with a matrimonial law specialist here in Charleston. Elliot looked at her in surprise. And what did he tell you? That the clauses in the prenuptial agreement are practically unappealable. If I ask for a divorce, my family will immediately lose all financial support. My father would go back to being neck-deep in debt. My mother would have to abandon her treatments. My siblings would have to leave university. The implications were devastating. Elliot felt a crushing weight settle in his chest. But then he remembered the notebook tucked in his suitcase, the words he had written the night before, the promise he had made to himself. I have money, he said with determination. My mother left me a considerable inheritance that I've never touched. We could use it to ensure your family is safe while we find a more permanent solution. Lillian looked at him with eyes bright with contained emotion. You would do that. Risk everything. Your relationship with your family, your inheritance, your reputation. For me? I would do it for us, he replied, taking her hand across the table. For the chance to live an authentic life, without masks or pretensions. A life where I can wake up each morning beside the woman I love, instead of constantly wondering what she's doing, if she's happy, if she thinks of me as much as I think of her. The words hung suspended between them, laden with promises and dangers. The coffee had grown cold, forgotten, while the future took shape before their eyes like a blank canvas waiting to be painted with new colors. I don't want to keep waiting, Lillian finally said, her voice surprisingly firm. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what if. I don't want to wake up 30 years from now and realize I lived a lie when the truth was so close. They spent hours talking, tracing plans that oscillated between the improbable and the impossible, but which under the soft lights of that Charleston cafe seemed perfectly achievable. He would use his personal savings to ensure her family was protected. She would face the divorce and accept the consequences. They would begin a new life away from the Montgomery yoke, perhaps in Savannah or in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The bravest decisions, thought Elliot, as they walked back to the hotel under a now completely starlit sky, are not those we make in moments of strength, but those we embrace precisely when we are most afraid, when everything we believed secure crumbles beneath our feet. The return to Westchester was like waking abruptly from a beautiful dream to face a hostile reality. The estate, which before had seemed simply a golden cage, now felt like a guarded prison. Lillian noticed different looks from the staff, whispers that ceased when she entered a room, a new tension in the way Collins addressed her. Something had changed, but she couldn't identify exactly what. Harrison, contrary to his custom, began to spend more time at home. He cancelled a scheduled trip to Boston, delegated meetings he would normally have attended personally, and even started appearing punctually for dinners, something that hadn't occurred in months. One morning, as Lillian ate breakfast alone in the courtyard as always, her husband unexpectedly joined her. He was dressed casually, something extremely rare for him, linen pants and a white shirt unbuttoned at the neck, without the tie that seemed a natural extension of his body. "I have a surprise for you," he announced, pouring coffee into a cup in front of her. "I've organized a small party this weekend. Nothing too formal, just some close friends and family." Lillian looked at him in surprise. In the 10 months they had been married, Harrison had never shown interest in organizing social events that weren't directly related to business. "May I ask what the occasion is?" she inquired cautiously. "Do we need an occasion to celebrate?" he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought you'd like it. You always seem so alone here. Besides, I've invited Elliot. Lately, he seems to be avoiding us, don't you think?" Lillian felt the ground move beneath her feet. The casual mention of Elliot, combined with that calculating look, activated all her internal alarms. "That's very considerate of you," she managed to respond, keeping her voice steady despite the growing panic. "Would you like me to take care of anything? The menu, perhaps, or the flowers?" "Oh, don't worry about anything," said Harrison, making a careless gesture with his hand. "Collins will take care of all the details. You just make sure to look radiant that night. I've specially commissioned a designer dress that will arrive tomorrow." With that he rose, leaving the coffee practically untouched, and left the courtyard with relaxed but determined steps. Lillian remained motionless, the fork suspended halfway between the plate and her mouth, trying to decipher what had just happened. Her first instinct was to call Elliot, to warn him, but her calls and messages went unanswered all day. With growing anxiety, she went to her studio, hoping to find in painting the calm she needed to think clearly. As she prepared the canvases and paints, she heard the voices of Collins and Harrison in the hallway, just outside her half-open door. "Strange behavior in Charleston," Harrison was saying in a low but clearly audible voice. "I saw them leave the hotel together. They were gone for hours." "Sir," Collins replied with a conciliatory tone, "perhaps they were just taking a walk. The madam had never visited the city, and your brother knows it well." "Don't take me for a fool, Collins," retorted Harrison, his voice acquiring a cutting edge. "I know my brother. He has always coveted what is mine. First our father's attention, now my wife." Lillian held her breath, paralyzed by fear. The voices gradually moved away down the corridor, but the words kept echoing in her ears like a sentence. With trembling hands, she took her phone and tried to contact Elliot again. This time, to her relief, he answered on the second ring. "I can't talk for long," she said in an urgent whisper. "I think Harrison suspects something. He's organizing a party this weekend and has specifically invited you. He mentioned seeing us together in Charleston." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I knew this could happen," Elliot finally responded, his voice tense but serene. "Don't worry. I have a plan. Remember what we discussed in Charleston. Maybe it's time to put it into action sooner than planned." "Are you sure?" she asked, anxiety evident in every syllable. "Everything is happening so fast." "Sometimes fate forces our hand," he replied. "Don't be afraid, Lillian. Whatever happens, I'll be by your side, I promise." The call ended, leaving her with a mixture of terror and strange calm. For the first time since the limousine stopped in front of Trinity Church 10 months ago, she felt she had something real to fight for, something worth any sacrifice. The days leading up to the party passed in a state of unbearable tension. Harrison continued with his unusual kindness, bringing her increasingly elaborate gifts, antique family jewelry, exclusive designer dresses, even a golden retriever puppy she had admired during a walk through Westchester months earlier. But his eyes remained cold, calculating, constantly observing her like a scientist studying a potentially explosive chemical reaction. On Saturday afternoon, as she prepared for the party, Lillian made a decision. She opened the small jewelry box where she kept the few possessions she had brought from her previous life and extracted a thin silver chain with a small seashell pendant. It was a gift from her maternal grandmother, the only person who had always believed in her talent as an artist, in her right to be happy on her own terms. "Give me strength, Grandma," she murmured, placing the chain around her neck. The pendant remained hidden beneath the neckline of the elaborate blue designer dress, but she could feel its reassuring weight against her skin. The party began punctually at 8. The estate gleamed with hundreds of strategically placed lights to enhance the centuries-old architecture. The gardens had been transformed into an outdoor salon, with tables elegantly arranged among illuminated trees and bubbling fountains. A chamber orchestra played classical pieces in one corner, creating a refined yet welcoming atmosphere. The guests, approximately 50 people among close friends, family, and some carefully selected business associates, appeared delighted with the display of elegance and hospitality. Lillian played her role perfectly, smiling, conversing amiably, behaving like the perfect hostess she was expected to be. But her eyes constantly searched among the crowd, awaiting Elliot's arrival. Finally, when dinner was about to be served, she saw him enter the garden. He was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that accentuated the breadth of his shoulders and the honey color of his eyes. His expression was serene, almost determined, like that of a man who had made an irrevocable decision and was at peace with the consequences. Harrison, who had been animatedly conversing with a group of investors near the main fountain, visibly tensed upon seeing his brother. With a forced smile, he excused himself and headed directly toward him. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, extending his hand in an apparent gesture of brotherly cordiality. Elliot shook the offered hand, holding it perhaps a second longer than necessary. "I wouldn't miss a party organized by my older brother. It's such an unusual event." Lillian observed the exchange from a distance, feeling the electricity in the air, the storm approaching under the starry Westchester sky. "The most dangerous confrontations," she thought as she headed toward the brothers with a carefully rehearsed smile, "are not those that begin with shouts and accusations, but those that develop beneath the surface of social courtesies, like sharks swimming under apparently calm waters." The dinner proceeded with the choreographed precision of a ballet. Exquisitely presented dishes appeared and disappeared. Cut crystal glasses reflected the light of candles strategically placed on each table. Polite conversations flowed like the wine that was generously served. Lillian was seated at the main table between Harrison and Mr. Nathaniel, who had surprisingly arrived that same afternoon from his estate in Virginia. Elliot occupied a place at the other end of the table, next to a distant Montgomery cousin, a middle-aged woman with whom he politely conversed, without taking his eyes off Lillian, more than strictly necessary. Midway through the second course, Harrison stood up, glass in hand. Silence gradually spread through the garden as the guests expectantly turned toward their host. "Dear friends and family," he began in a clear, powerful voice, the voice he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. "Thank you for joining us on this special night. Some of you may be wondering what occasion we're celebrating." He made a theatrical pause, looking at Lillian with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm delighted to announce that very soon the Montgomery family will grow. My wife and I are expecting our first child." The collective gasp was audible. Applause and congratulations immediately erupted. Lillian remained petrified, her face a perfect mask that concealed the horror and confusion she felt inside. A child. It was impossible. Her mind worked frantically, trying to understand what was happening. Elliot's eyes, fixed on her from the other end of the table, reflected the same shock. For a terrible instant, it seemed he would stand up and deny the news right there. But then, Mr. Nathaniel placed a hand on his arm, an apparently paternal gesture that contained an unmistakable warning. Lillian found herself forced to stand beside Harrison, to receive embraces and congratulations for a pregnancy that didn't exist, to smile and thank people as if her world weren't crumbling before her eyes. When she finally managed to escape under the pretext of needing a moment to refresh herself, she ran into the house, seeking refuge in the library that had been her sanctuary for months. She closed the door behind her, leaning against the massive wood as she tried to control her breathing. She wasn't alone. A figure moved among the shadows, Elliot, who had evidently had the same idea of seeking a moment of privacy. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "No," she immediately responded, horrified at the mere suggestion. "It's impossible. Harrison and I almost never—" "We almost never—" She couldn't complete the phrase, the pain and humiliation blocking the words in her throat. "It's a trap," said Elliot, approaching her but maintaining a prudent distance. "He's trying to force you to stay, to renounce any escape plan. And to me he's sending a very clear message. Stay away from my property." The cruelty of the strategy was overwhelming. Lillian felt tears threatening to overflow her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not when she needed all her mental clarity. "What are we going to do?" she asked, desperation filtering into her normally controlled voice. Elliot took another step toward her, his eyes bright with determination. "Go forward with our plan, but faster than anticipated. Tonight, when the party ends and everyone has gone, you'll gather your most essential belongings. I'll wait for you at the Westchester train station. The first train to New York leaves at 5 in the morning. New York? I thought we would go to Savannah or the Blue Ridge Mountains. Change of plans. New York is just the first stop. From there we'll fly to Savannah. I have a friend with a house in the historic district where we can stay while we sort out this whole matter." The library door swung open abruptly before Lillian could respond. Harrison was there, his figure silhouetted against the hallway light, flanked by Collins and Mr. Nathaniel. "What a moving scene," he said with cutting sarcasm. "My pregnant wife and my little brother planning their romantic escape in my own house during a party I organized specifically to expose them." Lillian instinctively stepped back, but Elliot stood firm, facing his brother without a trace of fear or shame. "There is no pregnancy, Harrison," he said in a clear voice. "It's just another of your manipulations. You've always used people as pieces on your business chessboard. But Lillian is not another acquisition. She's a human being with the right to seek her happiness." "Happiness?" Harrison repeated with disdain. "What do you know about happiness, little brother? You've always been the weak one, the dreamer, the frustrated artist who didn't have the courage to confront Dad and follow his own path. And now you think that by stealing my wife, you'll compensate for all your insecurities." "Enough," intervened Lillian, finding her voice amid that storm of accusations. "I am not a possession that can be stolen. I am a person who was sold as merchandise to save a family from bankruptcy. A business deal disguised as sacred matrimony." Mr. Nathaniel, who until then had remained silent, took a step forward. At 75, he continued to be an imposing presence, with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed capable of dismantling any lie. "I always knew this marriage was a mistake," he declared, with a brutal frankness that surprised everyone. "My oldest son has never been capable of loving anything beyond work and vineyards. My youngest son has a heart too big for the cruel business world." He paused, looking alternately at his two sons and at Lillian. "Perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements that preserve both the family honor and the sanity of all involved." Harrison looked at his father with genuine surprise, as if he had never considered the possibility that the patriarch would not unconditionally support his position. "Alternative arrangements? Are you suggesting I allow my wife to abandon me for my own brother? What kind of man do you think I am?" "A businessman," Mr. Nathaniel responded calmly. "And as such, you should recognize when an investment has failed and seek the best way to minimize losses." He turned to Lillian, his expression unexpectedly gentle. "Child, it's clear you're not happy here. And my son, despite this spectacle of indignant husband, isn't happy with you either. Both of you are playing roles in a play that should never have been performed." The silence that followed was absolute. In the distance, the party music continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the library. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice devoid of the previous anger, simply tired. "This doesn't end here," he said, looking directly at Elliot. "There will be consequences." He turned to Lillian. "As for you, you can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll discuss the terms of our separation." With that, he left the library, followed by Collins, who cast a last compassionate look at Lillian before closing the door. Mr. Nathaniel remained a moment longer, observing the couple with a mixture of resignation and something that almost looked like approval. "True love is rarer than diamonds in this world of ours," he finally said. "When you find it, hold on to it with all your strength, regardless of the consequences. I speak from experience." With that, he slightly inclined his head in a sort of salute and left, leaving them alone with the echo of his words. Lillian let herself fall into one of the armchairs, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Elliot knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "It was horrible," she murmured, tears finally overflowing her eyes. "But it was also liberating, like ripping off a bandage all at once. Painful but necessary." Elliot nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. "The path ahead of us won't be easy," he warned. "There will be gossip, judgments, probably economic difficulties at first, but we'll be together, living an authentic life, without masks or pretensions." The most devastating storms, thought Lillian as she wiped the tears from her cheeks, are sometimes necessary to clear the air, to allow new seeds to grow in previously barren soil. And after the storm, calm always returns, light always comes back. The days following the disastrous party were a strange limbo. Lillian remained at the estate but moved to one of the guest rooms in the wing opposite from Harrison's. Elliot, meanwhile, returned to his apartment in town but visited the family property daily, participating in long closed-door meetings with his brother and a constant parade of lawyers. The news of the fake pregnancy was discreetly denied among the guests as a regrettable medical error, an explanation that no one openly questioned, but which fueled countless rumors in northeastern social circles. A week after the confrontation, Lillian was summoned to Harrison's office. The room, decorated with heavy mahogany furniture and portraits of Montgomery ancestors with severe looks, had always seemed oppressive to her. Now seated before her still husband, she felt strangely calm, as if she had left fear behind along with pretenses. "Our lawyers have reached a preliminary agreement," Harrison announced without preamble, pushing a leather folder toward her. "Discreet divorce without media scandals. In exchange for your cooperation and silence, I'll guarantee your family's economic well-being." Lillian took the folder but didn't open it immediately. "Why would you do that?" "After everything that's happened," Harrison studied her with those calculating eyes that seemed to constantly assess the cost-benefit of each situation. "Because I'm a practical man, Lillian. This marriage was a mistake from the beginning. Not because you aren't a suitable wife, but because I never intended to be a true husband." He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed genuinely reflective. "Perhaps my father is right. I've never been capable of loving anything beyond work and the vineyards, and you deserve better than that." The unexpected sincerity left her momentarily speechless. Finally, she opened the folder and reviewed the terms of the agreement. They were surprisingly generous. A substantial pension for her parents, guaranteed education for her siblings, even a trust fund for herself that would allow her to live comfortably while establishing her career as an artist. "There is one condition," Harrison continued when she finished reading. "You and Elliot will wait an entire year before making your relationship public. No appearances together, no photographs in magazines, nothing that might fuel rumors of infidelity or family betrayal. It's the least I can demand to preserve the company's reputation in the financial markets." Lillian slowly nodded. A year of discretion seemed a small price to pay for the freedom being offered to them. "There's something else you should know," Harrison added, rising to serve 2 glasses of an expensive aged whiskey he reserved for special occasions. He offered one to Lillian, a gesture of civility he had never before had with her. "Elliot has renounced his part of the family inheritance. He has completely ceded it to the Montgomery Foundation for historical heritage preservation." Lillian looked at him in surprise. The Montgomery inheritance was considerable, even divided among the 5 brothers. That Elliot would voluntarily renounce it was an enormous sacrifice. "Why would he do something like that?" she asked, although deep down she knew the answer. "To be free," Harrison replied with a sad smile. "Something I've never achieved, despite all my successes and riches." He raised his glass in a solemn toast. "To your happiness, Lillian. Something I could never have given you, no matter how much I tried." She raised her glass, returning the gesture with a mixture of relief and a certain sadness for what might have been if the circumstances had been different, if they had been different people. "To new beginnings," she responded, for all of us. That afternoon, when Elliot arrived at the estate for what would be one of the last meetings with the lawyers, he found Lillian waiting for him in the cherry orchard. She wore a simple white dress and her hair loose, swaying gently with the spring breeze. She looked younger, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I've signed the papers," she announced when he approached. "I'll be officially free in 6 weeks." Elliot smiled, but there was a shadow in his eyes that she knew well. "I heard about the inheritance," he said directly. "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged, a deliberately casual gesture that didn't fool anyone. "Because it doesn't matter. It's just money, Lillian. Money that came with invisible chains, with expectations and obligations I never chose. I prefer to start from zero, to build something of my own, something ours if you want to share it." Lillian moved closer to him, gently touching his cheek in a gesture of intimacy they no longer needed to hide, at least within the walls of the estate. "Do you know what that means to me? Not just that you renounced your inheritance, but that you did it without even mentioning it to me, without using it as proof of your love or your commitment." "True love doesn't need proof," he replied, covering her hand with his own. "It demonstrates itself in small moments, in daily decisions, in the willingness to build something together, despite difficulties." They remained that way for a moment, enjoying the simple joy of being together without secrets, without guilt, without the weight of the forbidden. The future awaiting them was full of unknowns, but for the first time, these unknowns were exciting rather than terrifying. "The most important negotiations," reflected Lillian as they walked together toward the house, their fingers intertwined like a silent promise, "are not those that occur in elegant offices with lawyers in expensive suits, but those we make with ourselves, deciding what sacrifices we are willing to make for what we truly value." Spring gave way to summer, and with it came the warm winds of change. The divorce was finalized discreetly, with the same efficiency with which Harrison conducted all his business. The specialized press barely devoted a few lines to the event, mentioning irreconcilable differences and amicable separation, vague terms that concealed the true story behind that union and its dissolution. Fulfilling their part of the agreement, Lillian and Elliot maintained their relationship in strict privacy. They met in the small apartment he kept in town, away from indiscreet eyes. She began to exhibit her paintings in small galleries under a pseudonym, surprised and gratified when her works started to sell on their own merits, not for being associated with the Montgomery name. During these months of transition, Lillian rediscovered parts of herself that she had forgotten or suppressed during her marriage. Her passion for morning walks, her love for traditional New England cooking, her ability to genuinely connect with people without the barrier of social status. One September morning, as she prepared coffee in the kitchen of Elliot's apartment, the phone rang. It was Collins, the faithful Montgomery butler, calling for the first time since the separation. "Mrs. Lillian," he said with his characteristic formality, "I hope not to disturb you. Mr. Harrison asked me to contact you. Something has happened that perhaps you should know." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. Had Harrison discovered that she and Elliot were still seeing each other? Was he threatening to withdraw support from her family? "What happened, Collins?" she asked with a tense voice. "Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Nathaniel has suffered a minor stroke." The butler's voice softened, aware of the impact of his words. "The doctors say he will recover completely, but the scare has been considerable. He is in the private hospital in Boston. Mr. Harrison thought you and Mr. Elliot would want to know." Lillian thanked him for the information and promised to transmit it to Elliot as soon as he returned from his meeting with a potential client for his new business of historic building restoration. The news put them in a difficult position. On one hand, they wanted to respect the agreement to remain publicly distant. On the other, they felt the moral obligation to visit the Montgomery patriarch during his convalescence. "We should go," Elliot decided that night as they dined on the small terrace of the apartment. Separately, of course, on different days, but we should go. After all, he's still my father. Lillian nodded, understanding perfectly. Despite everything that had happened, family ties persisted, complicated but undeniable. 2 days later, she found herself in the private room of the Boston hospital, surprised by the fragility of the man she remembered as such an imposing presence. Mr. Nathaniel seemed to have aged 10 years in a few months, his face marked by new wrinkles, his hair completely white. "You came," said the old man, his voice weaker, but retaining that characteristic clarity. "I wasn't sure you would after everything." "Of course I came," Lillian replied, sitting beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Mr. Nathaniel made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "The doctors exaggerate. A small scare, nothing more. At my age, any stumble becomes a national emergency." He looked at her with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed capable of reading the soul. "You look well, Lillian. Better than when you lived at the estate, definitely." She blushed slightly, uncomfortable but grateful for the old man's frankness. "I'm finding my way." "With my youngest son?" he asked directly, without a trace of reproach in his tone. Lillian hesitated, unsure how to respond without violating the agreement with Harrison. Mr. Nathaniel laughed softly at her evident discomfort. "Don't worry, child. I'm not here to judge or create problems. On the contrary." He paused as if gathering strength for what he was about to say next. "I wanted to speak with you before Elliot came tomorrow. There's something you both should know." With visible effort, the old man sat up slightly in the bed and continued. "I've modified my will. The part of the inheritance Elliot renounced, I've placed it in a separate trust. It won't be available until 6 months from now, when the year agreed with Harrison is fulfilled. But after that," he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere face, "after that it will be completely yours, without conditions or strings attached, for you to use as you see fit." Lillian looked at him, stunned. "But why would you do something like this?" Elliot voluntarily renounced that part. "Because sometimes parents need to correct our mistakes," Mr. Nathaniel responded with surprising frankness. "I always favored Harrison, always considered him the strong one, the worthy heir to the empire I built. Meanwhile, I ignored Elliot's qualities, his sensitivity, his integrity, his capacity to see beauty where others only see utility." His eyes moistened slightly, a show of emotion Lillian would never have expected from the Montgomery patriarch. "My little scare made me see clearly what I should have seen decades ago, that true strength is not in ruthless ambition, but in the courage to follow one's own heart." When Lillian conveyed this conversation to Elliot that night, he reacted with a mixture of emotion and caution. The reconciliation with his father, although late, meant more to him than he was willing to admit. The question of the inheritance, however, generated contradictory feelings for him. "I didn't renounce that money to recover it later," he said, walking restlessly around the small living room of the apartment. "I did it to be free, to start over without owing anything to anyone." "I know," Lillian responded gently, "and I think your father knows that too. Precisely because of this, he wants to return it to you, not as a family obligation, but as a gift. A recognition of the person you truly are." Elliot stopped by the window, contemplating the city lights that gleamed in the distance. "Maybe you're right," he finally conceded. "Perhaps part of growing up is learning to accept both mistakes and reconciliations, to forgive not only others but also oneself." In the following weeks, as Mr. Nathaniel gradually recovered, something unexpected began to happen. The relationship between the Montgomery brothers, which everyone had given up as irremediably broken, slowly began to heal. It would never be what it was, certainly, but a new dynamic emerged based on mutual respect and the acceptance of their fundamental differences. Harrison, perhaps inspired by his father's near-death experience, seemed to have developed a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. Elliot, for his part, found the courage to openly share his architectural restoration projects, discovering with surprise that his older brother offered not just moral support, but also valuable contacts in the business world. "The most significant rebirths," reflected Lillian one afternoon as she painted in her new studio, a luminous loft with panoramic views of the Hudson Valley, "are not those that occur at once, with dramatic external changes, but those that develop gradually, rebuilding from the foundations that which we believed irreparably destroyed." Winter arrived in Westchester with unusual mildness, as if nature wished to facilitate the transition to the new life Lillian and Elliot were building. Only 2 months remained until the agreed year was fulfilled, the time when they could finally make their relationship public and officially begin their life together without secrets or restrictions. Elliot had managed to establish his small architectural firm specializing in historic building restoration. He began with modest projects, restoring colonial houses in Massachusetts that had seen better days. but gradually his reputation grew. His respectful approach to heritage, combined with an artistic sensitivity uncommon in the sector, attracted clients who sought something more than a simple structural rehabilitation. Lillian, for her part, had found her voice as an artist. Her paintings, now signed with her real name, began to be recognized in increasingly wide circles. A small gallery in New York had organized her first solo exhibition, and the critics had been surprisingly positive, highlighting the emotional intensity and originality of her technique. One January morning, as they had breakfast in the kitchen of the apartment they now unofficially shared, Elliot dropped news that would change the course of their plans. "I've received an offer to restore a house in Savannah, Georgia," he said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide his enthusiasm. A 17th-century building with colonial and Victorian elements, practically abandoned for decades. The owner wants to convert it into a small boutique inn. Lillian looked at him over her coffee cup, immediately recognizing the spark in his eyes, the same that appeared whenever he talked about old buildings with stories to tell. "It sounds fascinating," she replied. "Where exactly in Savannah?" "In the historic district, with a view of the river. It's surrounded by centuries-old live oaks, a short distance from Forsyth Park." Elliot paused, studying her reaction. "I would have to spend several months there, personally supervising the works. It's too complex to delegate." Lillian nodded slowly, understanding what he wasn't explicitly saying. "And you're asking if I would go with you?" "I'm asking if you would consider the possibility of not only going with me, but staying there. Permanently." The words rushed out as if he had been containing them for days. "I've researched the area. There's a growing artistic community, painters and sculptors attracted by the unique southern light, by the dramatic landscapes, by the authenticity of a life away from urban noise." He leaned toward her, taking her hands in his. "It could be a new beginning, Lillian. Away from the Montgomerys, from memories, from indiscreet eyes. A place where no one knows us, where we can simply be ourselves." The proposal took her by surprise, but not unpleasantly. For months they had vaguely discussed their joint future, assuming they would remain in the Northeast, perhaps moving to a nearby city like Boston or Philadelphia, where the Montgomery name would carry less weight. "What would happen with my exhibition in New York? With the contacts I'm beginning to establish here?" she asked, not as an objection, but to better understand Elliot's vision. "You wouldn't have to give up anything," he assured her. "New York is just a few hours by plane from Savannah. You could travel for important exhibitions and events, and as for contacts—" He smiled, gently squeezing her hands. "You're too talented for your art not to find its way wherever you are. Besides, there's something special about the South, something I believe would nourish your creativity in ways you don't even imagine now." Lillian closed her eyes, letting her mind visualize the possibility. A Victorian house with a view of the Savannah River. Rooms illuminated by that southern light so different from the filtered luminosity of the Northeast. A studio next to a garden, where the colors would be completely different from those she had painted all her life. The image had an undeniable appeal, a promise of total renewal. "I need to think about it," she finally said, opening her eyes. "It's an important decision." Elliot nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But there's something else you should know." He paused as if gathering courage for what was coming next. "I've already found the perfect house for us, an old Victorian mansion with a view of the square. It has an annex that could be converted into your studio, with large windows that would let in that special light that only exists in the South. It's a short distance from the center, close enough not to feel isolated, but far enough for absolute privacy." Lillian looked at him with a mixture of surprise and amused resignation. "You've already decided we're going, haven't you?" He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Let's say I have great faith in our ability to recognize an extraordinary opportunity when it presents itself." His expression became more serious. "But if you truly prefer to stay, I'll understand. We could look for another solution. Perhaps divide our time between the North and the South." Lillian stopped him with a gesture. "I didn't say I don't want to go, just that I need to process this. It's a huge change." "I know," he replied softly. "And precisely because of that, I think it's what we need. A radical change, a new chapter written completely by us, without shadows from the past." The following days were of intense reflection for Lillian. She walked the streets of Westchester, contemplating the Hudson as she had done so many times since arriving in the city, wondering if she was prepared to leave behind the familiarity of the Northeast, the changing seasons, the mild climate that permeated the spring nights. In the afternoons, she visited galleries and museums, absorbing the rich artistic tradition of New York that had profoundly influenced her work. Could her art evolve in a completely different environment? Or would it lose something essential in the transition? One afternoon, as she contemplated a landscape of the Hudson Valley in a local gallery, she had a revelation. What she loved about art was not its ability to capture the familiar, but precisely the opposite. Its power to transform the unknown into something intimate, to discover beauty in the unexplored. That night, when Elliot returned from a meeting with clients, she was waiting for him with 2 glasses of bourbon, a deliberate nod to the decision she had made. "Tell me more about that house with a view of the square," she said simply, handing him one of the glasses. The smile that illuminated Elliot's face was worth more than all the certainties in the world. Without words, he took out his phone and showed her photographs of a beautiful Victorian mansion with a wraparound porch, surrounded by gardens that in spring would be covered with magnolias. The interior needed work, but the possibilities were evident even in the imperfect images. High ceilings with wooden beams, generous windows that framed spectacular views, an interior courtyard that promised cozy nights during the occasional southern rains. "It's perfect," whispered Lillian, feeling an unexpected emotion at the prospect of beginning this new life. "Absolutely perfect." They kissed then, sealing without words the pact of future, the promise of shared adventures in unknown lands. The kiss tasted of bourbon and infinite possibilities, of freedom, and that love that had survived all the reasons why it shouldn't have existed. The most promising horizons, thought Lillian as they separated, their foreheads still together, breathing the same air laden with hope, are not those we can clearly see from where we stand, but those we dare to imagine beyond the limits of our experience, in territories yet to be discovered. News of their imminent departure for Savannah spread quickly among the circle of close friends and family. Reactions were varied: surprise, congratulations, some well-intentioned concerns about how radical the change was. Lillian dedicated the following weeks to properly saying goodbye to the people and places that had marked this crucial stage of her life. One of the most difficult visits was to her parents in Nantucket. Although the relationship had improved considerably since the divorce was finalized, without the catastrophic economic consequences they feared, an underlying tension still existed. Her mother, whose health had notably improved thanks to treatments they could now afford, received her with a warm but fearful embrace. "Are you sure about this, dear?" she asked as they shared tea on the small terrace of the family apartment overlooking the Atlantic. "Savannah is so far away, and you barely know this man." Lillian smiled patiently. "I know him better than I ever knew Harrison, Mom, and the distance, maybe it's exactly what we need. A place where we can build something completely new." Her father, who had been unusually silent during the entire conversation, finally spoke. "Your mother is afraid of losing you again," he said with a frankness that was new to him. "The first time we lost you was my fault, because of my financial mistakes that forced you to accept that marriage. Now that we've finally gotten you back, that we see our true daughter again, and not that sad shadow you became during your time with the Montgomerys, it's hard to accept that you're going so far away." Her father's words, so unusually emotional, moved her deeply. "You won't lose me," she promised, taking both their hands. "I'll come visit you regularly, and you can come see our house in Savannah. You'll love it, I'm sure. It's a magical place." Before leaving, she left them several paintings she had created especially for their home, luminous landscapes of the Nantucket coast, tangible memories of her presence that would remain even though she would be physically absent. The farewell with Harrison was surprisingly civilized. They met in a discreet cafe in the center of Westchester, neutral ground where neither had an emotional advantage. He had subtly changed in the months since their separation. He seemed less rigid, perhaps even a bit more reflective, although he maintained that aura of absolute control that characterized him. "So, Savannah," he commented after initial greetings, "a radical change. I always thought Elliot would end up in Boston or New York, somewhere with enough cultural activity to satisfy his artistic inquiries." "We both need a new beginning," Lillian replied simply. "Away from complications." Harrison nodded, perfectly understanding what she wasn't saying. The agreed year ends in 3 weeks, he noted. Technically, you could make your relationship public before leaving. Why the rush? Lillian studied him, looking for some sign of reproach or bitterness in his question, but found only genuine curiosity. It's not about fleeing or hiding, she explained. It's about building something of our own, on our own terms, without the constant shadow of the past or others' expectations. To her surprise, Harrison smiled with what seemed like sincere understanding. That makes sense. In fact, it's probably the smartest thing you could do. He paused, contemplating his coffee with a thoughtful expression. I'll confess something to you, Lillian. For a long time I was furious. Not because you fell in love with my brother, but because together you had the courage to pursue what you wanted, to break conventions, to risk everything for something authentic. He raised his gaze, his eyes unusually vulnerable. It's a type of courage I've never had. The confession left her momentarily speechless. This wasn't the Harrison she had known, the relentless businessman for whom everything was reduced to strategies and benefits. There was a new dimension to him, a capacity for self-reflection he had never shown during their time together. It's never too late to find that courage, she finally said. He laughed softly without humor. Perhaps. Though at 44, radical changes become more complicated. His expression grew more serious. In any case, I wanted you to know I harbor no grudge, not toward you nor toward Elliot. In fact, I've recommended him to several potential clients in Georgia and South Carolina. We have some hotel projects in development in the South that might interest him. That's very generous of you, she replied, genuinely surprised. It's not generosity, Harrison corrected with an ironic smile. It's business pragmatism. My brother has exceptional talent for architectural restoration. It would be stupid not to take advantage of it just because of hurt feelings. When they parted, Harrison handed her a small package wrapped in tissue paper. A farewell gift, he said with a certain shyness uncharacteristic of him. Open it when you're in your new home. Her last visit was to Mr. Nathaniel. The Montgomery patriarch had recovered remarkably from his stroke, although doctors insisted he moderate his whiskey consumption and avoid upsets. She found him in the garden of the estate, seated under a century-old oak tree, contemplating the fields that extended as far as the eye could see. "So you're taking my youngest son to the south," he said by way of greeting, his voice stronger than she expected. "To lands of magnolias and Spanish moss, far from the northern cold." Lillian smiled, recognizing the teasing tone beneath the apparent complaint. "It was his idea, not mine," she defended herself, sitting in the chair he indicated beside him. I know. He always had that adventurous streak since childhood. While Harrison dreamed of expanding the family business, Elliot fantasized about forgotten mansions and ruined churches. The old man sighed, his gaze losing itself in distant memories. "I should have paid more attention to those dreams, encouraged them instead of trying to channel them toward what I considered useful or practical." "It's never too late to support them," said Lillian, unconsciously repeating the same thing she had said to Harrison days before. "Mr. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do now. The trust fund will be available to you in 2 weeks, just before your departure, without conditions, as I promised, for you to use as you see fit." He turned his head to look directly at her with those penetrating grey eyes that had intimidated generations of businessmen and politicians. "I have only one wish, although it's not a condition, that you be happy, genuinely happy. Okay, it's something money can't buy, as I learned too late in my life." The old man's sincerity moved her deeply. Impulsively, she took his wrinkled hand between hers. "We will be," she promised, "and you will always be welcome in our home whenever you want to visit us." Mr. Nathaniel smiled, slightly squeezing her hand in a gesture of affection he had never shown before. "Perhaps I will, when the weather is too cold here. They say Savannah winters are like northeastern springs, mild and colorful." At nightfall, Lillian returned to the apartment she shared with Elliot, physically and emotionally exhausted by the farewells, but also strangely light, as if each conversation had released a weight she didn't know she was carrying. She found him on the terrace, contemplating the sunset over the Hudson, a vision that would soon be just a memory. "How were the goodbyes?" he asked, embracing her from behind as they both contemplated the natural spectacle. "Surprisingly well," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "It's as if everyone had finally accepted that this is right, that it's not an impulsive escape, but a thoughtful and courageous decision. And you? Are you still convinced? He asked, his voice slightly tense, revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed. Lillian turned to look at him directly, taking his face between her hands. More than ever, she affirmed with absolute certainty. I'm not moving away from something, Elliot. I'm walking towards something, toward us, toward the life we want to build together, toward a future that finally belongs completely to us. They kissed under the starry Westchester sky, sealing once more the promise of that shared future. In 2 weeks they would leave behind the northeastern weather, the gardens of jasmine and cherry trees, the shadows of the past. Ahead awaited the magical breeze of the south, the infinite squares, the historic mansions that stood against the sky like vigilant guardians, and above all the freedom to write their own story without imposed scripts. The most significant farewells, thought Lillian, as they melted into an embrace that seemed to contain all the promises of the world, are not endings, but disguised beginnings, thresholds we cross with hearts full of hope and eyes open to new wonders. A year later, on a summer morning with the scent of jasmine and humid earth, Lillian awoke in the Victorian house in Savannah, Georgia. The first rays of sun filtered through the natural linen curtains, projecting golden patterns onto the wooden beams of the ceiling. She could hear Elliot in the kitchen, preparing coffee and softly humming a southern melody he had learned from locals, the same one he used to whistle in the corridors of the library in Westchester, in another life that now seemed so distant. She stayed a few minutes more in bed, enjoying the sense of peace that had enveloped her each morning since they moved to the south. The transition hadn't been easy. The hot, humid climate of coastal Georgia, so different from the mild northeastern weather, had required significant adaptation. The house, though beautiful, needed months of careful restoration to become the welcoming home it now was. The neighbors, initially reserved with the northern outsiders, took time to open up, but when they did so wholeheartedly, integrating them into community life with a touching generosity. Elliot entered the bedroom with 2 steaming cups of coffee, his smile illuminating his entire face upon seeing her awake. It was that smile that began in his eyes before reaching his lips, the same one she had learned to love during those impossible months in Westchester. "Good morning," he said, offering her one of the cups that emanated the intense aroma of strong coffee she so enjoyed. "I dreamed about you." Lillian accepted the coffee, her fingers brushing his in a contact that, even after a year together, continued to send small electric shocks through her skin. "What did you dream?" she asked, genuinely curious. Elliot sat on the edge of the bed and leaned in to kiss her forehead with that characteristic gentleness that made each everyday gesture seem like a declaration of love. "I dreamed we were finally free," he replied simply. "And then I woke up and realized it wasn't a dream." Lillian laughed, that authentic and full laugh he had memorized years ago during a gala in Westchester, when all this was just an impossible desire. 365 days of our new life. They had celebrated many firsts during that year. The first night in the house, still without adequate air conditioning, cuddled under cotton sheets while the tropical rain beat against the crystals. The first time they opened all the windows to the river, toasting with artisanal bourbon to the dreams that were beginning to materialize. Lillian's first exhibition in a small Savannah gallery, where her new works, inspired by southern landscapes, had received enthusiastic praise from local critics. The first visit from Mr. "Do you know what day it is?" she asked, intertwining her fingers with his. "How could I forget?" Elliot responded, his expression becoming slightly more solemn. "It's exactly 1 year since we arrived at this house." Nathaniel, who had instantly fallen in love with the tranquility of Savannah, and now planned to spend all his winters in a nearby house he was acquiring. But this anniversary had a special meaning. It not only marked a year since their move, but also the complete fulfillment of their mutual promise. They had built a life together, in their own way, away from the shadows of the past. And they had succeeded, despite all the difficulties, the days of doubt, the nights of nostalgia. "I have a gift for you," said Elliot, rising to fetch something from the wardrobe. He returned with a flat package wrapped in artisanal paper, decorated with small pressed wildflowers. Lillian opened it carefully, revealing an old drawing notebook, its yellowed pages full of architectural sketches. Arches, capitals, facade details, all realized with the precision of someone who truly sees and understands the structural beauty of buildings. "It was mine," explained Elliot, sitting again beside her, "from when I was 17 and dreamed of studying architecture instead of business. I found it among my things when I was unpacking my office a few days ago." Lillian turned the pages with reverence, recognizing in those youthful drawings the talent that Elliot now employed daily in his restoration work. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Why hadn't you shown it to me before?" "Because it represents something that for many years I considered a failure, a path not taken, a weakness," he confessed. "But now I see it differently. It represents the origin of what I finally became, the guiding thread that brought me here, to this life we share." Lillian closed the notebook and hugged him tightly, moved by the profound significance of the gift. "I have something for you too," she said when they separated. From her bedside table she took out a simple envelope that she extended to him. Elliot opened it with an intrigued expression, which quickly transformed into surprise upon reading the contents. "Is this... are you..." She nodded, her eyes bright with contained emotion. "I'm pregnant 3 months. The doctor confirmed it yesterday while you were in Charleston with your clients." Elliot's face transformed with a joy so pure, so absolute, that Lillian felt her heart expand to impossible limits. In an impulsive movement, he lifted her in his arms and spun with her around the room, laughing and crying simultaneously. Child," he murmured when they finally stopped, his forehead resting against hers, his hands gently placed on her still flat belly. "Our child." "Or daughter," added Lillian with a smile. "It's too early to know." "It doesn't matter," he replied, kissing her softly. "It will be perfect either way, like everything we've created together." They dressed slowly, enjoying the tranquility of the morning, the shared novelty, the expansion of possibilities that now opened before them. They had breakfast on the porch that overlooked the garden they had planted together, with a view of Forsyth Park that stretched majestically against the intense blue sky. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night," commented Elliot, as he spread locally made blackberry jam on a slice of bread, "about opening a small cultural center here in the restored carriage house. I think it's a brilliant idea." Lillian smiled, pleased that he had seriously considered her suggestion. The previous night, inspired by a visit from a group of local school children who had come to see her paintings as part of an art field trip, she had proposed the possibility of creating a space where local artists could exhibit their work, where workshops could be held for young people, where the community could gather around art as a point of connection. "It would be something small to start with," she said, mentally visualizing how the space could be adapted. "But I think it could mean a lot for this place. There's so much talent in these neighborhoods, so many stories that deserve to be told and preserved." Elliot nodded, his expression reflecting the same enthusiasm she felt. "We could use part of my father's trust fund. I can't think of a better destination for that money than creating something that benefits the community that has welcomed us." They spent the rest of the morning elaborating plans, drawing possible distributions of the space, listing local artists they could invite for the first exhibitions. Their shared vision was taking shape, as had their house, their relationship, their life together. Gradually, with patience and dedication, building something solid on firm foundations. In the afternoon, they went out to walk along the historic streets of Savannah. The air smelled of sea and food being prepared for lunch, a perfume that Lillian had learned to love as much as the milder scents of the north. Children played in the squares. Women chatted on the porches of colorful houses. Life flowed with a vitality that constantly renewed them. They stopped at the top of a hill, contemplating the view that stretched at their feet. The intense blue river, the line of live oaks on the promenade, modern Charleston in the distance, a mosaic of history and future coexisting harmoniously. "Do you ever regret it?" Elliot suddenly asked, breaking the contemplative silence they had been sharing. "Everything you left behind. The mountains, the mild climate, the family, the friends." Lillian reflected before responding, taking time to be completely honest, as they always were with each other. "Sometimes I miss certain things," she admitted. "The scent of the mountains after rain, the specific taste of the blueberry muffins my mother made, the morning mist over the Hudson." She paused, turning to look at him directly. "But never, not for an instant, have I regretted the decision we made. Because it wasn't about choosing between the north and the south, between the cold and the heat. It was about choosing between an imposed life and an authentic one, between existing and truly living. Elliot took her face between his hands with infinite tenderness, as if he were holding the most precious of treasures. "I love you," he said simply, "more than words can express. And each day I love you more because each day I discover new facets of you, new reasons to be grateful, that you had the courage to risk everything for what we felt." They kissed under the open sky, with the river as a silent witness to their love, a love that had been born in impossible circumstances, that had survived social conventions, family expectations, and personal sacrifices. A love that now flourished freely, without restrictions or shadows, as natural and beautiful as the southern flowers that grew around them. They returned home when the sun began to set, tinting the sky with pink and golden hues that Lillian immediately wanted to capture on a canvas. As she prepared her brushes and paints in the studio they had adapted in the room with the best light in the house, Elliot turned on the ceiling fan and put on soft music, a selection of traditional southern melodies interpreted with flute and guitar. That night, after a simple dinner prepared with products from their own garden, they sat on the porch talking in low voices about the names they would like for their son or daughter, about the projects they wanted to complete before their arrival, about the dreams that now included this new being they already loved without knowing. "Home is not a place," thought Lillian as she observed Elliot's face illuminated by the soft moonlight, so full of hope and love that it seemed to radiate its own light. "Home is the person with whom you can be completely yourself, with whom you can share both joys and fears, with whom each day is a new opportunity to grow and discover. Home is the space, physical and emotional, where you finally feel complete." And as the gentle Atlantic wind caressed their faces, as the night enveloped their Victorian house in a mantle of stars, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her true place in the world, not in the geographic coordinates of Georgia or New York, but in the heart of the man who loved her for who she truly was, and in the life they had chosen to build together, against all odds, against all the reasons why it shouldn't have been possible,